All right, so welcome to the fourth screencast on Monopoly. In this screencast, we're going to be looking at some of the problems with Monopoly. We already hinted at it a little bit in the last screencast that the monopolist is not going to be producing the efficient level of output, the Pareto efficient level of output. So monopolies can make societies worse off. Restricting output and charging prices that are higher than what would obtain in a competitive market is not a good thing. They operate inefficiently. As we're going to see in a second, there's going to be a deadweight loss of a monopoly. Just like we saw deadweight losses with taxation, deadweight losses with price controls, we're going to see that a monopolist in a market produces a deadweight loss. That is, there are transactions that do not happen that would have happened under a competitive market where the gains from trade are not realized. All right? This is referred to as a market failure, just like we saw with externalities and the lack of public goods. These were all examples of market failures. Monopolies often, markets often give us less choice for consumers, and there can be unhealthy competition among firms who want to be a monopolist called rent seeking. And this is where the monopolist tries to get the government to build up barriers to entry to protect their monopoly. All right. So let's look at this graphically. All right. So over here we have our perfectly competitive market, and over here we're going to have our monopoly market. So here's our supply and demand curve that we've seen since almost day one with our perfectly competitive market. Lots of firms, lots of buyers, lots of sellers. Firms and buyers are price takers. The equilibrium quantity is here where the supply and demand curves intersect. The equilibrium price is here where the supply and demand curves intersect. Okay? Over here is our monopoly market. All right? We have the demand curve, but we now have this marginal revenue curve for the monopoly firm. And remember, the monopoly firm is the market. So this graph is both that individual firm's graph and it's the graph for the entire market. So we have this twice as steep marginal revenue curve here. All right? We also have a marginal cost curve for the individual firm that looks like this. And what I've done here is I've put in what the quantity and price would be from the competitive industry. So I've just taken this and moved it over here because we want to think about the deadweight loss of having a monopoly firm. And so we need to be able to compare the outcomes under monopoly to some counterfactual, to some other world, to some hypothetical situation, however you want to put it, that is a competitive market for this same exact industry. Okay, so that's what I've done here by putting in the quantity and price from the competitive market. The monopolist, however, sets quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and picks that quantity to produce. Then they say, okay, if I want to produce that quantity, what is the price that the market will bear? And they can go up to the demand curve and read off the price. Notice, as we've said a couple times before, the price the monopolist charges is higher than what the competitive market price would be. The quantity that the monopolist produces is lower than what the competitive market quantity would be. Now let's look at this and I can show you exactly where the deadweight loss will be. All right. So here's the marginal cost curve for the monopolist. Here is the competitive market quantity and price. Here is the monopoly quantity. Again, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, that's the quantity. Then they go up and read off the price off of the demand curve. That's the monopoly price. This is the loss in consumer surplus. Remember, consumer surplus, let's see, get my highlighter. Consumer surplus for the competitive market is this triangle, right? It's all of those transactions. So all of those consumers were able to pay a price lower than their willingness to pay and able to enjoy that surplus. Now under monopoly, that surplus is lost, this amount here. All right. That surplus for that area goes to the monopolist, actually. They get that surplus. And this is actually the deadweight loss associated with a monopoly. These transactions would have happened under perfect competition, but now they don't happen. It just evaporates. The monopolist doesn't get that surplus. These are just transactions that no longer happen, so those gains from trade are no longer realized by the consumer or the producer. All right. So again, I keep coming back to monopoly versus competition in terms of quantity and price. So here's another graph Monopolies produce less quantity than under perfect competition. Monopolies charge a higher price than we would see under perfect competition. All right, that leads to a deadweight loss. With a monopoly, we get a deadweight loss. Under that perfect competition, under that model, there is no deadweight loss. Consumer surplus, producer surplus are both maximized. So total surplus is maximized. It's efficient. It's Pareto efficient, as we've said. And again, that definition is there's no way to make anybody better off without making someone worse off. Okay. Another problem with monopoly is it usually restricts the number of choices that the consumer has. All right. Consumers have a hard time finding substitutes. This restricts the ability of all the things in competitive markets where firms try to come into that market, they try to produce substitutes, they try to do lots of things that often push prices down. Those things don't happen under a monopoly. All right. Think of your local favorite monopoly, the cable company, and how they bundle things together. They're always wanting me to buy a telephone, like a wall phone for my house, like a landline, like I haven't had in like 15 years. The cable company's always telling me they'll give me a landline if I'll just up my bundle or whatever. I don't necessarily want that all that much, but the monopolist tries everything in its power to get you to buy those things. Monopolies also engage in rent-seeking often, which is a competition among big firms to try to secure monopoly profits, to try to push out competitors, try to raise barriers to entry. All right. Usually that type of competition results in one firm that's the winner, and then that firm gets protected by law in many ways. And of course, that's very inefficient because not just because the monopoly itself is inefficient, right, producing less quantity than the market would, higher price than the competitive market, but all those resources that are used to gain those barriers to entry, usually from the government, those resources are sort of wasted. They're just used to seek favor with the government and to lobby government. They're not put toward any productive sort of use.